Hello, everyone. So this afternoon, Booktopia will be hosting a very exciting conversation between two experts in their fields. We'll be welcoming Professor Raina McIntyre, physician, epidemiologist, and Professor of Global Biosecurity at UNSW, as well as journalist and political analyst Laura Tingle, the chief political correspondent for the nightly current affairs program, 7:30 on ABC. Thank you for tuning in. We're just currently waiting for Raina to join us, and then we'll make a start.
Thank you, Nick, and welcome, Raina. And I'm amazed that we both managed the technology, even though we're both really brainy. So I've been really enjoying the book, in amongst all the other dramatic developments of the last few weeks. So congratulations on it. We all became instant expert epidemiologists in 2020. I speak for myself personally, of course. And from my perspective, I suddenly found myself having a whole new collection of professional friends who I seem to be speaking to most nights on the television. What do you call a collection of epidemiologists? But you're the real deal. Maybe you could just tell us how you ended up doing what you do. What got you hooked on viruses and bugs?
Yeah, it was doing the Australian Field Epidemiology Training Program, and this is like an elite training program that was pioneered by the US CDC called the EIS, and it spawned over 100 programs around the world. And I was fortunate to be accepted onto that program very early on in its inception at ANU. So ANU still runs this program. And it's got a very different model of learning to what I'd been used to up to that point, having done medicine and, high school certificate, etc., all didactic learning. The model of learning is that you have intensive short bursts in the classroom where you learn technical knowledge, but you spend the majority of the time out in the field investigating outbreaks in placement. And I was placed at the health department in Victoria. So got to do the most amazing outbreak investigations, travel all over the place. It was a centralised health system. So if there was some outbreak in a little country town, a pair of us would get in a government car and drive off and investigate it and, come up with the answers, control the outbreak, etc. It was just a life-changing experience for me, and It changed my career direction. I'd intended to be a cardiologist. I really loved cardiology. I trained as a specialist physician, also public health and internal medicine. And never went back to that plan to do cardiology. I went straight into a PhD on infectious diseases and then a career in research.
What sort of outbreaks were you finding in small country towns in Victoria?
Well, one of them that I remember was an outbreak of gastroenteritis, and it's real shoe leather epidemiology. So you've got to, get your hands dirty and go and look. And we ended up finding out that there was a carcass of an animal in the water supply, in the town water supply. So that was, obviously it had contaminated the water. So it's real detective work, which requires critical thinking, but also hands-on kind of investigation. I did my first aged care outbreak as a field epi trainee at ANU, and that was an outbreak of something called Clostridium difficile, which can cause gas gangrene of the bowel. So it's a really serious infection, and there was an outbreak in a nursing home, and it probably was the mince meat that had been served, for dinner. And you've got to go through a sort of scientific process of looking at what everyone ate, what did the sick people eat, what did the well people eat, what foods were associated statistically with illness, etc. And, I went on to do a lot more research in aged care facilities, which has also been a lifelong interest for me, aged care outbreaks.
And, of course, they've been obviously pretty significant in the last couple of years. A lot of the audience might not know about some of the particular things you do, and I've got to confess they were things that I only discovered reading the book. One of them is the course in bioterrorism and health intelligence that you basically set up, I think, some time ago. Can you just tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so I was head of school of public health and community medicine at UNSW for 10 years. And during that time, a large focus of my career was education. And we also then formed an alliance with two other universities. It's called the Plus Alliance with UNSW, Arizona State, and King's College London. And as part of that, we had to develop some innovative online learning. And I was fortunate to have been taken on one of the early trips out to Arizona State University in 2015 and committed to developing this course. It was an area of my research. I've been researching bioterrorism since about 2006 after being on a committee that was looking at stockpiling for such emergencies. And I did a piece of research. It didn't sit right with me, the way we were prioritizing what to invest in. So I decided to come up with a different framework, a risk analysis model for prioritizing bioterrorism agents, got it published and won an award quite by surprise for it from the American Society for Military Surgeons. And so I went out to Salt Lake City to get that award, and that kind of spurred me to keep researching, particularly around smallpox, which had come up as quite a high risk on my research, where most people didn't think it was a risk because, it's stored in two high security labs in the US and Russia, and, you'd have to break in, which is an impossible task to steal it. So everyone's kind of thought the risk of smallpox is low. And that was the start of a longer career in researching biological warfare, bioterrorism, etc.
And just tell us a little bit about EpiWatch as well.
So EpiWatch is something that really was inspired by the 2014 Ebola epidemic, which was so catastrophic, and there was a lot of inaction for a long time. And I sort of thought, what if we could pick up these signals early and also attribute risk to the types of signal you're getting? So we got a grant from NHMRC in 2016, and that allowed us to start developing EpiWatch. For 2 years, we were really working on the public health side, the epidemiology, working out the diseases and the type of, basically we're searching open source data using artificial intelligence to get early warning signals much earlier than you'd get if you're sitting in a health department waiting for a notification to land on your desk. So the idea is you get a warning much earlier than you would, which then gives you a feasible prospect to stamp out an epidemic before it spreads around the world. So if there'd been something like that in November 2019, and the COVID outbreak, pandemic could have been stopped if it had been picked up before it had spread outside of China.
So let's talk a bit about the book. When we first discussed having this conversation, I sort of thought it would be about the pandemic that we've just been sort of living through the last few years, and what we've learned about it from your position of expertise. But it's much more than that. Before we dive into it, could you just give us a quick snapshot of what it's about and what you've set out to achieve in the book?
So it's really my attempt to try and pass on knowledge in a digestible format for the community to understand biosecurity, and that it is threatened because of the advance in technology and the kinds of technology that are available today. And essentially humanity is asleep at the wheel. We have a lot of awareness of other types of existential threats like climate change and cybersecurity, obviously. But I don't think anyone has, most of the community have no idea. We actually did some research looking at what awareness there was in the community about what you call dual-use research of concern, which is research that is intended for good but can also result in harm. And that harm can be the result of an accident, like a lab leak, or deliberate release. And both are really, really common. So in the book, I take the reader through a journey from the past, showing example after example of both deliberate and accidental epidemics and a pandemic. and show the recurring themes around them, which is silence and cover-up and denial of unnatural origins. And I look at the reasons why, what the vested interests are, and what the possible solutions might be.
You do, and some of them are somewhat hair-raising to actually read about. Can you go through a couple of the more notable episodes that you've talked about in the book of those unnatural releases of bioagents?
Sure. I think for me, the best example that really illustrates the problem, and which I use in the course Bioterrorism and Health Intelligence to teach the students in a sort of scenario-based way, is an outbreak that occurred in the US in the 1980s. And it was in a town near Portland where all these people started getting sick with gastro. In the end, over 700 people were sick, and the public health authorities, including the US CDC, because it was such a huge outbreak, they called the CDC in. They investigated, and they found that everyone had eaten out at a restaurant. But it wasn't just one restaurant, it was 10 different restaurants. There was no common ingredient, not the water supply, and they shut down the restaurants. The outbreak stopped, and they said that it was because of unsanitary food handling, even though the inspection showed the restaurants to be reasonably sanitary. There was a politician who put up his hand and said, I think the local cult poisoned the restaurants. And he was immediately branded a conspiracy theorist who was shouted down by the health authorities, silenced, and ridiculed. And this is, again, a common theme. The minute you suggest the possibility of an unnatural epidemic, you get attacked. You're labelled a conspiracy theorist, when actually these things have been quite common during history. So 6 months later, Rajneesh, you might remember the Rajneeshis, the orange people. Rajneesh himself confessed that indeed his cult had poisoned the restaurants, but his confession wasn't believed. So that's how hard it is to prove an unnatural epidemic when even a confession isn't believed. And 12 months later, quite by accident, the FBI was doing a raid, immigration raid on the Rajneesh ranch, and they came across a laboratory which had all these really dangerous pathogens there, much more dangerous than what they used, which was salmonella. And they were doing it as a practice run to contaminating the town water supply to control a local election. So there was quite a complex reason why they did it. But the whole thing was covered up for 12 years. Nobody spoke about it. No one knew about it. So any local people who were affected, because the Rajneesh has also poisoned individuals with things like poisoned chocolates and poisoned water bottles, etc. No one who'd been harmed would have known about it. You know, it's like, let's not cause community panic. Let's just keep everyone dumbed down and stupid and not tell them what actually happened around them. And that just that story illustrates the whole problem to me.
So there's a lot of documentation of some of these unnatural origins of epidemics, but I know I've sort of read over the last few years about the greater risk of natural, if you like, epidemics or natural sort of crossover of diseases from animals to people because of climate change and greater pressures on space and all those sorts of things. If you had to rank the risks of unnatural versus naturally causing sort of new diseases, how would you rate the two risks to us?
So all those things are true, that climate change does increase the risk of zoonotic infections crossing over or spilling over into humans. But the rate of occurrence of climate change is much slower than the rate at which we've seen these new pathogens emerging, and you can't explain it by climate change alone. So I've done some research and published a paper showing a method, and I use it in my teaching as well, getting people to work out the probability of an unnatural and natural epidemic. And the way I see it, the probability of an unnatural epidemic is much higher than that of a natural one. And the other thing I touch on the book is information warfare and the idea of narratives and counter-narratives. So when there's a vested interest in a particular narrative, then there's a lot of effort put into that narrative. So we hear a lot about animals, and some of the examples I give in the book, like the Sverdlovsk anthrax leak, the animals were blamed. The 1977 Russian flu pandemic, which was a lab leak, the animals were blamed there as well. So the animals are a convenient, scapegoat for any kind of questionable outbreak, and that's usually the first call of port for scientists to blame.
Yes, well, they can't answer back, I guess, apart from anything else. Why is it so important for us to understand the origins of an epidemic?
Because the kind of technology we have today, which is genetic engineering and synthetic biology. So genetic engineering is the ability to, gain of function research, for example, is the ability to confer properties onto viruses or bacteria that they didn't naturally have that might make them more transmissible, more fatal, or more drug resistant or vaccine resistant. And the technology has really is revolutionary. CRISPR-Cas9, which is a gene editing tool, won the Nobel Prize for the two women who discovered it. It's been around for 10 years now, and the Soviet Union in their bioweapons program in the 1970s, they were trying to engineer chimeric viruses from smallpox and Lassa fever, now using very clumsy old methods. That will be so much easier to do today, and you can't tell me nobody's, when biological warfare has been there throughout human history, documented all along. Of course, there's people working on that stuff. We know that researchers are working on sort of engineered versions of SARS ever since the SARS outbreak in 2003. There's published papers on it. It's not a big secret. So that's one type of threat. And the other is synthetic biology, where you can make a virus in a lab from scratch. You don't need to get one. You can just make it. It's a bit like Jurassic Park, right? In Jurassic Park, they made dinosaurs in a lab. It's the same thing, but making a virus. And making a virus is much easier than making a dinosaur. It's technology that's been around for 20 years. The first synthetic virus was a polio virus in 2002. And more recently, in 2018, some researchers published a method for creating from scratch an orthopox virus. That's the same group of viruses as smallpox and monkeypox. And those viruses are all very, very closely related genetically. So if you can make one in a lab, you can make any of them. And that was really quite a scary moment. And to me, that was a warning bell back in 2018 that, for stockpiling for orthopox viruses and getting prepared for the possibility of serious orthopox virus infections. And of course, we've seen an unprecedented monkeypox epidemic this year. Those are the two big threats, and they really are existential threats to humanity. I mean, just with smallpox, and a really interesting story is two Australian scientists 20 years ago wanted to solve the mouse plague that we see in country areas. So they were engineering another orthopox virus called Ectromelia virus to sterilize the mice. And an unexpected side effect of their research was that it actually was universally fatal to the mice. It killed 100% of them, and it made the mice resistant to the vaccine, the smallpox vaccine. So those same mutations could get smallpox engineered to be 100% fatal and resistant to the vaccines, and that could be an extinction event. So that's why this technology is an existential threat to humanity.
You say that in the book, the challenges of ascertaining the origins of an epidemic is partly due to established ways of thinking about outbreaks, but denial of unnatural origins of epidemics is a recurring theme throughout history, as you've been saying. Too often, the basic question of whether a disease arose from nature or from human error or terror is not even posed. Why do you think that's the case when so much is at stake?
Well, what's at stake has actually changed over time. There's a lot more at stake now than there was 20 years ago. Partly it's just culture and training. So, in the health profession anyway, doctors, public health personnel, we're not trained to ask that question. We just assume everything's natural. When you look at, I opened the book talking about Operation Sea Spray, which was a US biological weapons experiment on their own people, where they sprayed bacteria over San Francisco. People got sick, one person died. The doctors thought it was so interesting. They wrote a paper about it in the medical journals, but they never thought it was unnatural. They never even thought about that. They just thought, ooh, what an interesting outbreak. So, it's just not there in our training. But then when you look at the sort of counter narratives, the disinformation, the aggressive attacks on anyone who suggests that an outbreak might be unnatural, like Jim Weaver, the politician in the Rajneesh case, there are vested interests at stake, right? One of those is the regulation and oversight of the practice of virological research. If, for example, it became public knowledge that the COVID pandemic was a result of a lab leak, that, because the consequences of the pandemic have been so catastrophic, it's going to change the practice of virology forever, everywhere. So that's what's at stake for scientists, right? And that's why there's a natural inclination to investigate things in-house, to not disclose, to cover up, and to deny. And, I give multiple examples of that through the book.
Sure. And it's only becoming more complicated when the issue is sort of politically weaponised, as it has been, for example, by Donald Trump, when it becomes part not just of a question of the impact on medical science and the economy of the world, but also on geopolitics. It creates a bit of a conundrum for us all, doesn't it? Because we've never seen more reliance on experts than we did during the pandemic. Yet what you're suggesting is that many of them are terribly compromised. It's not just the politicians who are compromised.
Yeah, there's compromise in the sense of, what you stand to lose. But another interesting theme that I explore in the book is the way the scientific community defends and protects their own when they've done something seriously wrong. And I give examples of that. And in the, to the point that you've just made, in the anthrax attack in the US following 9/11, there was an anthrax attack. A number of letters were sent out with anthrax in them to politicians and to media people. And, 11 people died. There were a whole lot of other cases of inhalational anthrax, massive decontamination effects. The main suspect in the end, who was about to be charged, was a US Army scientist who had been initially assisting the FBI with the investigation. He committed suicide just before he was going to be charged. But the only other suspect they seriously investigated was also an American scientist, because the strain of anthrax that was used in that attack had come from the US Army Infectious Diseases Research Lab. So that's the dilemma that law enforcement and intelligence agencies face. And we saw that in the US with COVID, that they have to turn to scientists for advice because they can't possibly replicate the kind of expertise you'd get in a big scientific institution, and yet, and then you get the political agendas come into play. In this case,
So I think what comes out of the book, as far as COVID and the whole Wuhan lab drama is concerned, is that you would be of the school which says that yes, there was a leak from the Wuhan lab, but it wasn't intentional. Is that right?
I wouldn't say anything definitively, because you can't. One of the key lessons I've learned in my career is never to convey uncertainty as certainty. When you do that, you're immediately compromised. You've got to keep an open mind. I think there is a lot of evidence that it could have been a lab leak. There's some satellite evidence and mobile phone data and other sorts of things that have been released that suggest there was some kind of major event possibly in Wuhan in October. And there's other lines of evidence which I discuss in the book. And it's a perfectly plausible explanation. So why shout it down? Why get hysterical when anyone says it? It is possible. Of course it's possible.
Sure. So do you think that COVID-19 was inevitable? Were there any clear signs that it was coming?
No, I don't think it was inevitable. I think pandemics can be prevented, but the problem is we invest everything at the pointy end of, so a true epidemic disease grows very quickly over time, over days or weeks. That's why you have health systems collapse. That's why you've got your supply chains affected. That's why the supermarket shelves get empty and you can't get your car serviced because everyone's really sick in a short period of time. Truly endemic diseases don't do that. Only epidemic diseases do that. So you don't have a lot of time to stop an epidemic from spreading. It's got to be done very quickly, which means you have to pick it up really early. But typically, all the investment is at the pointy end of it when after the epidemic's peaked, by the time you get drugs, vaccines. So the investment, 99% of investment is on developing drugs, developing vaccines and diagnostics. There's very little investment in prevention, and that's what we're doing with EpiWatch, which is trying to work out how we can benefit from artificial intelligence to try to get really early signals so that you can go in, investigate and stamp out an epidemic before it's spread beyond control.
So one of the really terrifying things in your book is that you canvass some of these issues about COVID and other diseases and historic episodes of it. But it's a very contemporary book, and as you've mentioned, you've canvassed the outbreak of monkeypox. But some of the really alarming revelations concern the very real and much greater threat from smallpox and what's been going on in terms of work to make it even more deadly. Can you tell us about this and how prepared we are to deal with a smallpox epidemic now? Is that actually a bigger risk to the world than COVID?
Not necessarily, unless it's engineered. The thing about smallpox, which is different from COVID as it is now, is that you don't have any asymptomatic transmission. So generally, to be able to infect other people, you've got to have symptoms. So you'd have a rash. So that makes it much easier to control. It also does not have an animal host. Any disease that also has an animal host is really, probably impossible to eradicate. So smallpox was ideal to eradicate because it doesn't have an animal host. It doesn't spread when you're asymptomatic. But of course, those things can all be engineered, right? We're now learning more about monkeypox. The same was thought about monkeypox, that you don't get asymptomatic spread. But there's now increasing evidence that you certainly can get asymptomatic cases of monkeypox and possibly transmission as well. So that's the thing. The genetic engineering just makes it really difficult to predict because it may not be the smallpox of old. In fact, the smallpox bomb I mentioned on the island in the Soviet Union, did I mention that? Anyway, They exploded a smallpox bomb on Vozdrozhdenia, which is a little island in the Aral Sea, and someone got infected 15 kilometres away, and that outbreak that was set off from that had a very, very high rate of what's called hemorrhagic smallpox, which is universally fatal. So normal smallpox, about 30% of people died. Hemorrhagic smallpox is like 100% fatality rate. So the Americans and other countries thought that was some special engineered strain that was much more fatal. They called it the Uralsk strain, but the Soviets always denied there was such a strain, and we don't know. Nobody knows what happened to all the smallpox that was at the that was developed, that was stockpiled in the Soviet Union, and what they did with it. And of course, what's possible to do with it now is exponentially greater than back then.
And as an aside, you mentioned that there's quite a lot of biolabs in Ukraine, which makes things even more exciting. Some of them are basically funded by the US. Are we in any way better placed to deal with sort of another epidemic, say, of smallpox than we were before COVID? I mean, which I suppose is the ultimate test of whether we've learnt much from this pandemic.
So the thing about smallpox is we already have vaccines that are successful, and there's, we don't know exactly how many doses there are in the world, but there's quite a lot of doses, and the WHO has a pledged stockpile. They've got some physical stockpile, not a lot, but there's countries have pledged parts of their stockpiles to the WHO. But if there's suddenly an epidemic, is the US going to release the vaccine they pledged to the WHO for other countries, or are they going to hang on to it for their own people? That's the question. And we exercise that in Pacific Eclipse, which is a tabletop exercise which I discussed in the in the book with my colleague David Heslop, who I've also mentioned in the book. And we looked at those issues, about vaccine nationalism and countries not being willing to release their vaccine, which then makes the epidemic, this is a smallpox epidemic in this tabletop that we ran, that then makes an outbreak that could have been controlled in 3 to 6 months. It goes on for 8 years plus because the vaccine wasn't used appropriately where it was needed the most. But of course, you can engineer vaccine resistance to smallpox. So if it's an engineered virus and it's resistant to the vaccines, then it's back to square one. It's a bit like the variant chasing we're doing now with COVID.
So we're sort of getting towards the end of our time, but I suppose what I'd be interested to know, we're talking about the way dissenting views have been stomped on, and the sort of resistance to actually getting to the heart of these issues. It's been a pretty extraordinary couple of years for you and for a lot of other epidemiologists. What sort of toll has it taken on you? And as you write in the book, the level of personal attacks when you've been trying to contribute to the debate have been pretty next level.
It's not taken a great toll, to be honest, because I've actually, as I explained in my chapter about the face masks, that was work that started, in 2006. I became an object of hatred over that research and have been for over a decade because I showed that N95 masks are more protective than surgical masks. And it all came to a fore during COVID. So it was nothing new to me. I've been the subject of all kinds of hate campaigns for a very long time. I've been attacked by health ministers 10 years ago. So it's nothing new to me, and I'm quite resilient. I'm not someone who talks a lot of nonsense about stuff I don't know about. I'm talking from a position of knowledge, and what you see is what you get. And that's all I can say. I'm very resilient. I'm not one that cares much about what people think of me, or I've never been susceptible to peer pressure. So I just carry on doing my work, and wanting to contribute to public health, to the prevention of disease, and to control of disease, and to making people's lives healthier, and I'm concerned about our young people. I've got 2 children in their early 20s, it doesn't matter so much what happens to me. If I get long COVID and heart failure and dementia in a few years, it doesn't matter as much as it does for my children because they've got their whole lives ahead of them. I don't want them to be having multiple infections with this virus and, all their organ systems becoming irrevocably damaged. We need to think about our children and the future that we're building for them. And, I'll continue to advocate for public health.
And that presumably means, despite the abandoning of all sorts of mandates in the last little while, that you'd still say to people, wear a mask when you can.
No, I'm not into raging against the machine. I know when to pick the battles, and I don't waste my energy on things that are kind of futile, which is why I don't do much media anymore. Yeah. There's just no point raging against the machine. I just carry on with my work and try to make a contribution where I can, and through my research mainly. And the book is important because it's about democratization of knowledge. I want people to have knowledge to empower themselves with knowledge and not be dumbed down with all the propaganda that's drilled into them.
Well, it certainly is an eye-opener and, an absolutely fascinating read. So congratulations on that, and, and thank you for all your work over the years. And we're a bit done for today, unfortunately, time-wise, but if all the people who've been enjoying this conversation want to order the book, you can order Dark Winter from Booktopia, and it's out just in the next couple of weeks. But in the meantime, thanks so much for talking to us, Raina.
Thank you so much for giving up your time, Laura. I really, really appreciate it.
An absolute pleasure.